So first of all, it's important to recognize that the church has been always changing. There's never been a real constant, this is the way it is forever. There's always been some cultural adaptation. We now have Christmas trees. Those are only a couple of 100 years old, and yet we consider them essentials in this tradition. That's just one example. The other thing that's important to realize is that our image of God also has to incorporate both the image of God as being stable, reliable, the rock, the steady point that we can turn to in the greatest turmoils of our lives, and also has to say that God is not static, historical, but moving with us into all the changes of the present. And our worship says that in a number of ways. The buildings, those are an image of stability, a safe place to come. The liturgy itself, we have the Psalms. That's a historical tradition brought forward from the ancient Hebrew into the Christian tradition. And that's been the rock and the bedrock of the prayers of generation after generation after generation. The music spans a 1,500-year time. What's new? Well, sometimes it's the building architecture that changes. Sometimes what changes is not our choice. Sometimes in the Diocese of San Joaquin, my diocese, a whole bunch of us are worshiping in temporary quarters because there's that other group that still claims our property. Sometimes it's natural forces. Diocese of Louisiana, after Hurricane Katrina, the churches were destroyed. The neighborhoods were destroyed. You worship in temporary places. You bring new elements into it. You bring new elements in as the neighborhood changes, as the people who are there change, as you begin asking, how do you know God? What do you have to offer God? What is it that spoke so clearly to you about God in your previous churches and worship experiences? What speaks to you about God outside in the world? What is it that you need to bring into the church out of the rest of your life to bless it and make it holy? What do you need to take out of the church to bring life to the rest of your life? So as you start asking these questions, you discover a couple of things. One is that change is terribly threatening, and the other is that change is enlivening. A personal story. Years ago, shortly after I very reluctantly started attending church, feeling like I'd been dragged through the gutter by the scruff of my neck, I really didn't approve of what God was doing to me. But I was slowly making peace with little bits of the service that were coming to have positive meanings for me. The rest of it tended to disappear into some sort of devil's dictionary of horrible meanings that couldn't possibly have anything to do with God, and yet I didn't know how to translate them differently. And one of the small pieces that had meaning to me was that the way we, at that point, sang the Lord's Prayer. It was a responsive form. The priest sang a phrase, we sang it back to them. And to me, that was like God inviting me into the prayer and me responding with my whole heart. And then one day, just in passing, the priest said to me, you know, I'm going to have to change the way we do that one of these days before that becomes locked in concrete and everybody believes that's the only way to do it. Within 24 hours, I was back in his office in a full-blown panic attack because that was the one thing that I could grasp hold of that spoke to me of God in that worship. And the idea that that might be changed was horrendous. Very hesitantly, he said to me, well, the traditional thing that I'm supposed to say to somebody at this time is that you're supposed to worship God and not the method, not the structure, not the liturgy. But I don't know if that's the right thing to say to you, he said. Well, I took it and I thought about it, and by 24 hours I'd been able to realize that the way I related to the Lord's Prayer, to that particular saying of the Lord's Prayer, was like God offering me the first blooming flower of spring. It was the promise of everything else that I could come to receive from liturgy. It wasn't the end. And that if I lost that, there would be other flowers springing up. So how do we make change possible? How do we make it less threatening? And part of the way that we do that is by changing what questions we ask and telling the stories. So this week, first of all, you have a few readings that are just about the traditions of liturgy. If you're already well familiar with that, skip over them or skim them real briefly. A couple of readings about why we are feeling so much pressure these days to change our liturgy, who it is who doesn't seem to receive God through our liturgy. By the way, not all these readings in this week or any week are strictly from the Episcopal tradition. I'm drawing on a variety of different sources. And then we look at a couple of stories. Two stories about how people came to encounter God in a traditional, more or less traditional, but adapted liturgy, and what it was that it made it possible for them to see that. In one case, you have a young person who came to see the liturgy through the eyes of an older person who showed her what and why she loved it. In the other case, in a book that I really value, When God Speaks Through Worship by Craig Satterlee, he's developed a technique where instead of explaining liturgy to people, he says, you know, I don't think I can explain it. Let's try it and then talk about what God may be saying to us through it. And he tells the story about a series of experiences that started with Maundy Thursday when he did that in one particular congregation. The video introduces us to a little bit about the emerging church, and I'll meet you in the forums.